We're beginning Matthew chapter 26 this evening. I don't keep track of these things, but fortunately Michael does, and so I was checking on the website and discovered that I started Matthew in February of 2021. So we've been going at Matthew for quite a long time, with breaks, of course, in between, but it's been a long time. And actually, those first studies, for some time, were not done here in the church, but I was recording them at home because we weren't meeting with the pandemic. And so the first studies for some time were done, recorded from at home. And then we've been meeting here, but we've got as far as Matthew 25. And in a sense, I would say that in doing Matthew 1 to 25, we have done the introduction to the gospel. And now we're going to get to the main story in chapter 26. Now that may sound a strange way of putting it, but I'm actually just paraphrasing a very famous statement made by a prominent New Testament scholar who defined the Gospels in this way. They are passion narratives with extended introductions. Now, I have to explain what he meant by a passion narrative, because we use passion in a very different sense. But when we speak of the passion narratives, the word passion is taken from the Latin and means the suffering of Jesus. And so the passion narratives are Matthew 26 and 27, Mark 14 and 15, Luke 22 and 23, John 18 and 19. They're the stories of the preparation, the Last Supper, the Gethsemane, the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion of Jesus. These are referred to as the passion narratives. J.S. Bach wrote the Passion according to St. Matthew, and what it amounts to is a setting to music of Matthew 26 and 27, with some other contemplative pieces as well. So the passion narratives are the stories of Jesus, basically his arrest, trial, and execution. And what this scholar is saying is that the Gospels are passion narratives with extended introductions. In other words, Matthew 1 to 25 is the extended introduction to the real heart of the Gospel, which is Matthew 26 and 27. The passion narrative, and the rest is an extended introduction, plus, of course, the resurrection in chapter 28. Well, is it true to say that 21, now, why would he say that 26 and 27 are the heart of the gospel and the rest is mere introduction? Partly, of course, just because these two chapters in all four gospels are just about the longest chapters in the whole gospel. So here's where the weight of the Gospels really comes. But it's not just that. Apart from these two chapters in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, basically everything we have is made up of short episodes, usually about 8 verses. And it goes from one episode to the next, to the next, to the next. Now, of course, Matthew interrupts them with 5 long discourses of Jesus, but otherwise it's basically, he healed this person, he said this to this person, he said this to somebody who potentially was going to be a follower, or he was tested on this question. And they take about 8, maybe 10 verses. Then it goes on to the next and the next, just a collection of short episodes, and in no particular order. Now, that might strike you as surprising because we sometimes see in the back of our Bibles the steps of Jesus and a whole progression of how exactly the order of Jesus' life took place. But if you compare the Gospels, you'll find that they don't keep the same order, and it does appear that the order of events basically was a matter of indifference to the Gospel writers. So a number of short episodes, short stories, in no particular order, leading up to Matthew 26 and 27, which is no longer one short story after another, but an extended narrative over 2 chapters in which the order is obviously very important. He has the Last Supper, goes to Gethsemane, he's arrested, tried, and executed, resurrection. It all takes place. It's all one extended narrative. Whereas the rest of the gospel is short episodes in no particular order, here we get a long narrative and a very consecutive order. More than that, though I said that the first 25 chapters are made up of short episodes in no particular order, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in each case, roughly halfway through the gospel, Jesus announces his coming trip to Jerusalem, that he's going to be turned over to the Gentiles, going to be crucified, and after 3 days rise again. And so suddenly, from about halfway through the Gospels, a little earlier in Luke, the whole Gospel is trending toward what's going to happen. And even though short episode follows short episode, even after Jesus' announcement, we are continually reminded of what's ahead. For one thing, Jesus 3 times announces to his disciples that this is what's going to happen. We're constantly being reminded of it. But there are other reminders as well, and they don't even start at that midpoint. But throughout the Gospel of Matthew, there are these reminders of what's coming, that this is all leading to the climax, which will be Jesus' death and resurrection. So in chapter 1 in Matthew, already we're told he was given the name Jesus because he was going to save his people from their sins. How does that happen? Obviously with Jesus' death and resurrection coming much later. Twice in the gospel, at least twice in the gospel, we're told incidents which are kind of a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to Jesus. Already in chapter 2, all the baby boys born about the same time as Jesus were put to death, foreshadowing what's going to happen to Jesus himself. And even more specifically, the execution of John the Baptist is told in Matthew chapter 14, and Jesus draws the parallel in Matthew 17. What they did to him, they're going to do to me as well. So in the execution of John the Baptist, we should see a foreshadowing of the coming death of Jesus. But more than that, Jesus talks about the necessity of taking up your cross and following me. Now that's a strange way of speaking of what it's going to cost to follow me if it were not for the fact that Jesus is going to be crucified and his disciples have to be willing to suffer and die as he did if they're going to be his disciples. So we're reminded when Jesus says already in Matthew 10, you need to take up your cross and follow me, that this is what's ahead for Jesus. James and John want to sit at the right hand or the left hand of Jesus in his coming kingdom, and Jesus asks them, are you prepared to drink the cup which I'm going to have to drink? Another reminder of the cup that he's going to have to drink, his suffering and death that are still ahead. Matthew 20:28, Jesus' disciples want to be foremost, and Jesus says, well, I myself didn't come to be served, but to serve, and to give my life a ransom for many. Another pointer ahead to what's going to happen at the end of the gospel. And then the parable of those who were given charge of the vineyard, and when the owner of the vineyard sends back his messengers, they mistreat them. He sends his son, and they put him to death. Obviously, another reminder of what's going to happen to Jesus. So throughout the gospel, there are all these short episodes, collections of sayings, and so on, but there's a dynamic. There's a thrust pushing forward throughout the gospel to the climax of the gospel, which we get in chapters 26, 27, and 28, the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so there's a point to saying that these gospels are passion narratives with long introductions, because the heart of the gospel is what happens with the death and resurrection of Jesus. And of course, that's true of Paul's message as well. When Paul summarizes what's important about his message, how does he summarize it? God forbid that I should glory except in the cross of Jesus Christ our Lord. Galatians 6:14. Summarizes his message in 1 Corinthians 1, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who perish, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, when I came to you in Corinth, I decided not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And he sums up his message, the message of the gospel, in 1 Corinthians 15 by saying, Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures, was buried and rose again. So the message of the cross is what is front and center in Paul's message, as it is in the Synoptic Gospels, or in all four Gospels, which is not to say that Matthew 1 to 25 are not important. Obviously they are, and we spent 2.5 years going through those chapters. They're very important. If you stop to think about it, Jesus was crucified, yes, but so were thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of others in the ancient world. We don't remember them. So what is it that makes the death of Jesus important? Well, we wouldn't know that if we didn't know who Jesus was and who Jesus is. And so, though Matthew 26 and 27 are the climax of the story, we need the rest of the story as well so that we know who this Jesus is and what's important about him, so that we will see the significance of his death and resurrection in Matthew 27 and 28. Not only that, but if we are followers of Jesus, we have to know what he was like in order to follow him, right? We have to know what he told us to do in order that we can do it as well. We have to see the kind of person he was so that we can be that kind of people too. The old WWJD, what would Jesus do? You don't know that unless you're familiar with the stories of what Jesus actually did. So these chapters are absolutely crucial. And yet, in a sense, they're preliminaries, and they only take on significance because of Jesus' death and resurrection. And those stories in Matthew 26 and 27 are the real climax of the Gospels. So let's look at Matthew 26, the first 13 verses, Lord willing, this evening. When Jesus had finished, we'll start with verses 1 and 2. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, actually there are 5 long discourses, as I've mentioned earlier, in the Gospel of Matthew, and they all end with the same expression, when Jesus had finished all these sayings. So you get that at the beginning of Matthew 8 after the Sermon on the Mount and so on. Matthew 11 after the discourse about the mission in chapter 10 and so on. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, but there is special significance to it here because this is the end of the last of his collections of sayings. So he really had finished all his sayings. And I'm reminded of John chapter 17, just before Jesus is arrested and so on. He prays to his Father, I have finished the work that you have given me to do. And you remember throughout John's gospel, some crisis arises, and Jesus says, but my hour has not yet come. The least of these crises is the lack of wine at a wedding, but Jesus says to his mother, my hour has not yet come. Other times when his life seems to be in danger, nothing happens because his hour had not yet come. But John 17, the hour is come. Now is the time for me to be glorified because I have finished the work that you gave me to do. Matthew also speaks of this as Jesus' hour, and it is when he has finished the earthly work that he was given to do, apart, of course, from its climax in his death and resurrection. So when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man is going to be delivered up to be crucified." When he says, "you know," that certainly applies to the first part of what follows. They knew that in 2 days the Passover was going to come. They couldn't miss that. Did they know the last part of what he says? You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man is going to be delivered to be crucified. Everything that you read in the Gospels suggests that, though Jesus had been announcing this all along, the disciples had not caught on. So perhaps we ought to say, you ought to know, you do know that after 2 days is the Passover, and you ought to know that the Son of Man is going to be delivered up to be crucified. But it's interesting that Jesus associates in these two halves of his sentence Passover and is being delivered up to be crucified. In other words, what happens at Passover and what happened at the first Passover is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen now with me. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5:7, Christ, our Passover lamb, is sacrificed. So that Passover lamb in the Old Testament has its place in the story of ancient Israel, but also has its place in the story of Jesus as a foreshadowing of what's going to happen with him. And that narrative, that is going to be picked up again in the Last Supper narrative. So you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man is going to be delivered. Let's pause for a couple minutes over his title, the Son of Man. Obviously, he's speaking of himself. And when we think of the title Son of Man, we usually think of Jesus in his humanity, as opposed to Son of God, his deity. Or not only his humanity, but his lowliness. And there are some sayings of Jesus which associate Son of Man specifically with his lowliness. For example, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The Son of Man associated with Jesus in his lowliness. Permit me to quote Rich Mullins in one of his songs here, who puts it in a very striking way. Birds have nests, foxes have dens, but the hope of the whole world rests on the shoulders of a homeless man. Let me repeat that. Birds have nests, foxes have dens, but the hope of the whole world rests on the shoulders of a homeless man. You had the shoulders of a homeless man. No, you did not have a home. Son of Man, associated with Jesus in his lowliness, even homelessness. But it's curious that the title Son of Man actually comes from a statement which emphasizes not his lowliness, but his exaltation. Because the title actually comes from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, when one like a Son of Man comes with the clouds of heaven and is given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. This is what's going to happen to one like a Son of Man. And when Jesus quotes or alludes to this saying in Matthew 26:64, he's clearly applying it to himself. And so the Son of Man title that we usually associate with his lowliness is actually, in its origin, a reference to his exaltation. And if you put the two together, what it amounts to saying is that the one who is going to reign over all peoples of the earth is first going to be handed over to be crucified. The path for him is through suffering to glory. And that, of course, is the path for us as well. If we suffer with him, we will also be glorified with him. Romans 8:17. And permit me another Rich Mullins quotation, another very cute way of making this very point. The song is about Daniel and his friends, in this case, his friends. And this is the way Mullins puts it. You'll meet the Lord in the furnace a long time before you meet him in the air. How's that for a good way of putting it? Just as Daniel's friends met the Lord in the furnace because there was a fourth like the Son of God with them in the furnace, so before we meet the Lord in the air in glory, we need to go through the path of suffering to glory as he did. You'll meet the Lord in the furnace a long time before you meet him in the sky. Okay, Jesus is going to be handed over to be crucified. Handed over, delivered up, by whom? Well, in the first place, by Judas. And that very language is used of Judas in verse 14 or verse 15. Judas goes to the chief priest and says, "What will you give me if I hand him over to you, if I deliver him up to you?" So Judas is the one, and that's going to be repeated later on. Judas is the one in the first place who hands Jesus over to be crucified. But it's not just Judas. The religious leadership of the Jews does so as well in Matthew chapter 27, verse 2. They bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate the governor. So Jesus is handed over on the human level, both by Judas Iscariot and by those religious leaders who tried him and then handed him over because they couldn't execute it themselves. They handed him over to Pilate. Handed over in these two ways on the human level. But then there's that statement of Paul in Romans 8:32. He who spared not his own son, but handed him over for us all. And it's the same verb being used again. So on the human level, Judas, with his greed or whatever was motivating him, hands him over. And the religious leaders, with their envy and whatever else was motivating them, handed him over. And that's all true on the human level, but there's another dimension to what's going on. God himself, through these human agents, or at the same time as these human agents are acting on the human level, God himself is handing him over because this is part of the Father's plan. This is part of the Father's will. Now, we need to remember in the case of Jesus and also in the case of our own lives, these two dimensions of our lives. Most people on earth, I think it's fair to say, are only aware of the human dimension. What they do, what others do to them, and so on, what takes place. And that's the extent of their vision, the human dimension of their lives. And they don't realize the crucial truth that we live before God, we live in God's presence, that all our ways are before him. And furthermore, that God is achieving his purposes through our lives. And so while we're very conscious and perhaps often only conscious, and most people are always only conscious of what's happening at the human level, there's another level going on at the same time, which in a sense is what is really significant. Now, I didn't say it's the only true story because what happens on earth is a true story as well. Judas really does act, and Pilate really does act, and the Jewish leaders really do act, and so do we, and so do people around us. This is a true story on one level. But it's only one dimension of what is really happening. It's losing sight of the dimension that all this is taking place before God, in his presence, and that he is achieving his purposes through all of this. Crucial to remember as we go on in the story that what happens to Jesus is not the curtailment of his mission by his enemies. Even though, in a sense, on one level, that's what it appears to be. But it's actually, and that's of course what they thought they were doing. They were bringing an end to this troublemaker's life by putting him to death on one level. But on another level, this was God achieving his purposes. And we need to remember that about our lives as well. Our times are in His hand. All that we do is before Him. God is with us, even in our darkest hours. I think we won't get on to verses 6 to 13. We'll postpone that for a week. But let's just look briefly at verses 3 to 5 as well. We've looked at that divine level in verses 1 and 2. Jesus has finished his mission, his divinely given mission, fulfilling prophetically the foreshadowing of the Passover by his death, and handed over in God's plan to be crucified. But now we're going to be confronted with the human level at its darkest. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." Notice the who, the where, and the why. The who, the chief priests and elders of the people, the elders of the covenant people of God, of the Jewish people. Those who are supposed to be closest to God, leading the covenant people of God, the nation that God has highly favored by his interaction with them and redemption of them, his giving them his law, and so on. And the leaders of that people, indeed the chief priests who most closely represent God, are gathered together against Jesus. And where are they gathered? In the palace of the high priest, in what ought to be sacred territory. These closest to God in principle are meeting in a sacred place at Passover season, at the time of the sacred feast, to plot against Jesus, to put him to death. But they have to do it by stealth, because sin loves darkness rather than light, first of all. Because as Cain killed Abel because his own deeds were evil and Abel's were good, and that aggravated Cain, so Jesus, in his divine goodness, aggravated by his goodness the evil that was in the hearts, even of these religious leaders of Israel. And they have to do it by stealth also, because they realize that otherwise they're going to be in trouble with the mob. Remember when they tested Jesus a little bit earlier? Jesus said to them, the baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? And they couldn't make up their minds, because if they said from men, all the people are going to be angry with them. Their public image is more important to them than anything else, and safety from the mob. And so they have to do this by stealth. They have to do their dirty deeds in the darkness and by stealth. Nonetheless, they are plotting against Jesus to kill him. And let's just end on this dire note. The world can often seem, and people in the world can often seem, to be not all that bad. Now, of course, when you read the newspapers, it highlights all that's bad and everything else, but there's much good, relative good, in the world as well. And the world may seem not all that bad, but is it not, as in the first century, so in our own, that the true character of the world emerges in its response to Jesus? In its response to God in human flesh, we see the true character of the world. In its response to the perfect goodness of Jesus Christ, the world responds, we can't have this. We can't tolerate this. This is too much for us. The character of the world, the character of the sinful human heart, though in other contexts it may look good enough, but the evil character of the human heart emerges most clearly in the presence of the divine Son of God and in his voice to us. May God open our hearts. Open our eyes, first of all, to see the divine dimension in our lives, that God is at work, that all that we do is before Him, that God is at work achieving His purposes in our lives as well, and that even in our darkest times, He is with us. May God transform our hearts by our Holy Spirit from this hostility which is in human nature, this rebellion, this estrangement from God which is in human nature ever since the fall, that we respond negatively, hostilely to the Son of God and to His goodness when we approach it. May God make us those who are followers of Jesus, transformed by His Spirit to want to do as He did, rather than His enemies. Amen.